Hey scrollers, welcome back to part 3 of the basic Intarsia Seashell series. I want to take a few minutes to go over the terminology I'll be using throughout the rest of this series. As scrollers, these are terms you might not necessarily be familiar with, so I think it's important that you get a good understanding of the way I'm using them and a little definition of what they actually mean. So let's go ahead and get started. I've come up with 4 primary terms to use to describe the cuts that I'm going to be making. And I created a little definition for them. We'll start off with critical cut, which is any part of a pattern where two different directions of wood grain or wood types touch each other and the size of the gap between the two pieces must be as small as possible. These cuts need to be made very carefully and accurately. Non-critical cut is typically outside cuts on the pattern where small cutting mistakes will not be noticeable or detrimental to the fitting up of the pieces. A segmentation cut is cutting one or more connecting pieces out of the same board where grain direction does not change. And veining cuts are a simple single line cut used to add highlights or definition to a piece. I'll go ahead and show examples of each type of cut. As you can see, I've gone ahead and highlighted with the red arrows to critical cuts. This adorable little cat is a pattern by Kathy Wise, and it can be found in her book called Intarsia Woodworking for Beginners. I chose this particular piece because it has a good variety of all the cuts I'm going to be talking about. It has your critical cuts, your non-critical cuts, your segmentation cuts, and also veining cuts. Critical cuts are in locations where a perfect fit between two pieces to eliminate gaps between the pieces is necessary to assure your piece comes out nice and clean. The red arrows are pointing to some of the areas that are considered critical, where careful and accurate cutting is required. As you can see here, we have a grain change. We have a vertical grain here and a diagonal grain here. So this cut here is considered a critical cut, along with right next to it here, and we actually have it in several places. We have the change of wood from a light wood to a dark wood. Down here you can also see we have two examples where a critical cut is really critical, because you've got no gaps here whatsoever between the two different varieties of wood, between the light wood and the dark wood. It happens in two places. We'll also have some of it up here around the head. You can pick those out by yourself. In order to make critical cuts, you've got to have a pretty good relationship with your scroll saw. And what I mean by that is you need to be cutting well enough to where you can actually follow a line or a circle and stay on the line inside the pattern. Because if you can't do that, it's going to be extremely difficult for you to make these critical cuts. So if you can't do that yet, don't get discouraged. Don't worry. Okay, just get some more practice. Practice up a little bit on your sawing. Just cut circles and squiggly lines and do your best to stay on the pattern. But don't worry if you still have gaps, which everybody is going to have some sort of a gap. Later on in this series, I'll show you how to fix them. And it's really not a difficult process, but just rest assured that just because you can't cut perfectly yet doesn't mean you can't do Intarsia. One more thing about these critical cuts, you really need to use a flat blade for them. Unless you are an absolute master at cutting perfectly straight with a spiral blade, I would highly recommend not using spiral blades for, in particular, these critical cuts. With non-critical cuts, it's basically anything that does not fit up to another piece. So as you can see, the back along here, if you mess it up a little bit, nobody is going to know the difference other than you. It's not going to be visible. It's not going to make the cut look bad or the piece look bad when you're finished with it if you come off the line a little bit here and there one way or the other. Now on to segmentation cuts. Segmentation in itself is basically another woodworking art form with the scroll saw. It does differ from Intarsia in the fact that you're using one entire piece of wood, one board, to cut your project out on. And here's a picture to show you what I'm talking about. The seashell can also be a perfect example of segmentation. You can literally take this pattern and put it on a board, cut it out as is, and then you will have what's considered a segmentation project. With the large difference being you don't have the critical cuts that you would have on a Intarsia piece, because you're not changing grain directions, you're not changing wood species either. As you can see in this cat here, we have this tail, the lower haunch, the back, and the front haunches of the cat are all out of one piece of wood. So that's technically segmentation, but it is cut no different than a critical cut is made. The only difference being is you know that after you cut this, the pieces will definitely fit because you're using one blade to cut the two pieces at the same time. A good portion of the head is also a segmentation, because these two pieces here are the same piece, and the little piece above the eye is also still out of the same piece. So all those pieces could be cut with laying just those three pieces of the pattern down on the board and cutting them out. It is really not uncommon for Intarsia pieces to incorporate segmentation in it, because it just makes sense sometimes. Like in this cat, it flows really well using the same board with the same grade throughout this piece. With segmentation, the cutting is not nearly as critical, because if you come off the line a little bit as you're cutting it, nobody will ever know the difference, and it won't show because there's no contrast in woods to actually highlight the mistakes. And as you can see, the purple arrows point out the different joints where the segmentation actually came into play. The sanding and shaping of segmentation is what helps to make the piece look more like an Intarsia piece. And finally, we have our veining cuts, which veining cuts are just put into the pattern to help give definition to a cut. As you can see, the cat would kind of look silly without a mouth, but the best way to define that is to make a nice, little squiggly cut in there to help define the mouth, and then you shape around to give it a little bit more definition. So veining cuts just help add a little accent to the overall picture. Now that we've got our vocabulary defined, we'll use this new terminology when it comes to laying out the second piece on the new pattern in part 4. We'll also go ahead and cut that piece out and maybe even get a little bit of sanding done. We'll just have to see how that goes. So until next time, happy scrolling, everybody.